The man smiled, reaching once more for the bottle in front of him. He raised it to his lips, taking a long swig and wiping the foam from the corners of his unkempt mustache before turning once more to his companion. After half an hour of conversation, it appeared as though something the young preacher had said to the man had finally stirred up some interest. "You mentioned a theophany. What's that?" the gruff man asked. The preacher reached down to his travel bag and wiped the still fresh dust from its buckles before pulling out a Bible. "Yes, sir, a theophany. It's not a word strictly associated with Jesus, but we mostly use it to describe times in the Old Testament when it's believed the Lord appeared in a physical form before he was born in Bethlehem. Are you familiar with the story of Jacob, how he wrestled with God?" The man took another sip from his rapidly emptying bottle, nodding wordlessly as he did so. "Well, that's a theophany. We know he struggled with a man until morning, when the man revealed himself to be the Lord, or an angel of the Lord anyhow. A lot of scholars believe that mentions of the angel of the Lord are Jesus himself anyways. What do you think?" The young preacher studied his friend's expression for any sign of interest. He had visited towns where hardly a soul could tell the difference between Moses and Noah, had never yet met a man like the bulky, haggard figure beside him, who already seemed not only immensely knowledgeable of Scripture, but wholly uninterested. The man shifted in his chair, scratching his roughened chin before calling the bartender over for another beer. After several moments of silence, he spoke once again to the preacher. The original language refers to the man as Elohim, which many translate to mean Big G God. Elohim really just means a god, a heavenly being. I think it was an angel he wrestled with. Not that that ain't impressive, mind you. The man took another sip of beer. "What about that, the burning bush?" The preacher raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "Well, just a thought, I guess. I met someone a few years back, real smart fella. He told me he believed that when Moses spoke to God through the burning bush, he was talking to Jesus. Same thing when God comforted Elijah on the mountain, that it was Jesus." "Well, in a way, yes. We hold Jesus and the Father to be two distinct persons, but both the same God." The man chuckled. "No, I mean like they were speaking to Christ himself, after he was born. When Jesus went up on the mountain for the transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appeared with him, and they talked to him, right? He thought maybe since God is bigger than time, he could be both then and now all at once. His idea was that when they appear in the New Testament, it's the same conversation that he's having with each of them back in the Old Testament too." The preacher furrowed his brow, leaning back into his chair. That's a unique thought. I don't know how much water it holds scripturally, but I must say it's creative at least." The two sat in silence for a while, content not to trouble each other any longer with speculation or trivia. It was late into the evening then, and more weary patrons had begun to stumble into the small bar, tired from a long day's labor. Not long after the last beams of orange sunlight slipped through the shuttered blinds, a small commotion began outside. The preacher heard shouting and the screech of tires, and after a few seconds, the wooden front door burst open with a clatter. A man, disheveled and sweating, took a second to lean against the doorframe. His face was red and glistening, and he was deeply out of breath. After collecting himself, he looked across the room towards two elderly police officers who had been hunched, playing cards at a small table. The preacher recognized the elder of the two to be the sheriff, a man named Emerson, with whom he'd made acquaintance that afternoon. The red-faced man at the entrance called out to the sheriff and his deputy, the distinct twang of panic caught between his haggard breaths. "They found him, Sheriff. The McBride boy, they found him out in the field." The sheriff had already begun to put on his coat, moving quickly towards the exit. The preacher sat in his seat, watching the situation unfold for several moments, before realizing that every other person in the small room was also rushing out the door. The preacher turned his head to his burly drinking partner, expecting in him the same urgency, but he found instead that the man moved slowly. beneath his rough skin and unkempt beard. His expression was grim as he paid his tab and trudged out the door in pursuit of the curious mob. The preacher collected his things once more into his dusty travel bag and left the bar, stepping out into the dim moonlight. He looked out across the highway, where the amassing crowd was already tearing through the wheat fields in a frenzy, flashlights in hand as their red-faced messenger led them onwards. Penuel Crossing, Kansas, was incredibly small back then. The township was entirely bisected by its defining interstate highway from which it clung to tightly. Across the highway to the west, where the preacher now faced, were the majority of the local farms. When he had rode into town on the Greyhound bus that morning, the preacher thought that in the blistering sunlight, the fields of wheat and corn seemed infinite in their breadth, stretching out into nothingness. On the eastern side, the small collection of stores, bars, and municipal buildings arranged themselves as almost a perfect row along the side of the highway. Behind them lay several houses and a few small livestock farms, clustered closely to the rest of the infrastructure. Nested neatly in the middle of it all was a small chapel, once well cared for. Those days were evidently long since past, its white paint chipping and its windows cracked and dusted. It had been the decline of this church culminating with the sudden death of the former pastor that had led to the young preacher being sent to Penuel Crossing that very day as a replacement. The preacher spotted the large man slowly making his way across the highway. He hastened his step to catch up, and between panting breaths asked him if he knew the McBride family very well. "I didn't, no. I'm about as new around here as you are, just passing through." "Oh, that explains why you're so well learned on the word. I reckon there ain't a seminary round here for 500 miles. Pardon me, by the way. I never caught your name?" "My name is Peter." "Never went to preach in school, Peter. You can call me Nolan." The pair crossed the threshold of the wheat fields, the waist-high stalks of grain trampled under the feet of the crowd preceding them. In the ever-spreading carpet of amber ahead, all sound was muffled amidst the rhythmic rustling of the harvest in the wind. They continued in silence, following the faint lights quickly disappearing ahead further into the fields. Only when the distant wailing of a woman far ahead came to their ears did they quicken their step. When they caught up to the rest, they were clustered frantically around chaotic scene. Ahead, just a few feet, was a large green tractor. It rested at an odd angle, slanted dramatically as though on uneven ground. Peter looked at its base to find that its back tires lay nearly half submerged in the soil. Oddly, the ground on which it sat lay dry and undisturbed, as though the tires had simply sunken through the solid ground. Its operator, a panicked young man, sat leaning against its dusted metal frame, tears rolling down his tanned face as he spoke between sobbing breaths to the sheriff. Peter turned his attention away from the tractor to try to see what the crowd circled around. Several men stooped down, struggling to lift the crying woman to her feet. She kept shrugging their arms off, falling back to the ground where she herself seemed to be struggling to pull something out of the soil. As he stepped closer, gently pushing his way through the crowd, the young pastor found the cause of distress, the lifeless body of the McBride child. At initial glance, it appeared as though only the upper half of the boy's body was present. He wondered, with sickening fear, if perhaps the boy had been run over by the tractor. Peter observed as the woman, whom he would soon learn to be the boy's mother, once again grabbed the child's small arm, trying to lift him up. The realization came that the boy's body, much like the sunken tires of the tractor, was half buried in the soil, with arms and head outstretched as though he had attempted to claw his way out of the dirt. When Mrs. McBride was finally pulled away from her child, Nolan began instructing some of the others to start digging out the boy's body. The red-faced man who had burst into the bar stepped back, eyeing Nolan with curiosity and suspicion before turning to speak to the sheriff. Peter watched in awe as the boy's body was quickly removed. the soil around his legs collapsing back in on itself, as though he had simply displaced the earth. Sheriff Emerson walked up beside Peter, letting out a heavy sigh as the pair watched. "I hope you'll forgive the chaos around here, Reverend." Peter's eyes didn't leave the unfolding scene, watching as the boy's mother swooped in to cradle her son's body. "What did the farmhand say? How did this happen?" "Poor kid got stuck, hopped out to take a look and tripped over the boy. Hell of a thing to find. He'll be all right in a few days, though." As Mrs. McBride clung to her child, she hugged his limp body tight, squeezing him. As she did, a sputter of water was pushed out of the boy's lungs, spilling onto the ground. The crowd stepped back in shock as the mother sobbed ever louder. As the last of the water dripped out of the boy's pale lips, Peter's nose curled. In the air, just for a passing moment, a harsh, chemical scent wafted by. It passed nearly as soon as it arrived. Nolan stepped back from the scene, dusting his rough hands off on his coat. Peter looked at him and saw inklings of teardrops forming in the creased corners of his eyes. Nolan mouthed something to himself in disbelief before turning to Peter and saying it aloud. He drowned. The boy's funeral was quiet, even for such a little town. Peter sat silent in the back row, daring not to interrupt the already painfully awkward service. The child, Benjamin, had been the youngest of 6. His siblings and mother sat in the front row, their sniffling echoing through the near-empty chapel, while their father gave a poorly rehearsed eulogy. Peter, now technically Penuel Crossing's spiritual leader, had offered to perform the funeral himself. He had been gently declined by the McBride family, who felt the service should be performed by those who had known Benjamin in life, not only in death. Peter, although understanding, couldn't help but feel the slight sting of rejection from members of his new congregation. He hoped that these people would soon come to trust him, even amidst the tragedy he emerged into. Within 20 minutes the service was over, and Benjamin McBride's small body was removed to be driven to the burial site, which Peter declined to attend to respect the privacy of the mourners. Once the small crowd had tearfully shuffled out, he walked out of the chapel and prayed silently that his next time attending his new place of work would not be another funeral. He crossed the side road, walking over to the dilapidated motel next door to the bar, in which he'd stayed the last few nights, and would likely keep staying in until a more permanent residence was made available. Standing outside the bar were Nolan, Sheriff Emerson, and the red-faced man from the bar. The 3 of them seemed to be deep in a heated discussion, one that Peter could tell was only intensifying as he made his approach. "I'm sure you had nothing to do with this, Mr. Carver, but you know the bind I'm in. We try to welcome newcomers like yourself here, but if Clark here saw you out in the fields the night Ben was found, I at least have to bring you in for some questions." Nolan crossed his arms firmly, leaning against the wall as Peter approached. "I understand that, Emerson, but we can do that right here. As I understand it, you and the deputy are the only officers in town anyways, so what good would it do to bring me into the station? I'll answer any questions you have right here." The red-faced man, Clark, scoffed and turned to protest to the sheriff, but was interrupted by Peter. "Excuse me for interrupting y'all, but am I understanding there's some suspicion in the death? I can vouch for Nolan the afternoon the body was found at least. We were in the bar speaking that evening, and before that he'd been sitting at the bar since about noon." Clark turned to the preacher, his brow furrowed in frustration. "He might have been, but I saw him out in those fields the night before that, when the kid went missing. He was just standing out there, a little bit past where the body was found." Peter looked over to Nolan, who scoffed. "I weren't nowhere near there, Sheriff. I can't prove it to you, but maybe you should start asking Clark why he was also out in the fields when the kid went missing and why he didn't bring it up until now." Clark slammed a shaking fist against the wall where Nolan leaned. "Because I, unlike you, live here and work these fields like everyone else. It's my livelihood. You, on the other hand, have barely left the bar since you showed up, except to stand out there in the field the night he went missing." Sheriff Emerson pulled Clark back away. "Nolan, you quit that and calm yourself down. Mr. Carver does bring up a good point, Clark. If you saw him out there that night, why didn't you say anything? It ain't a crime to stand out there. I thought he was a new farmhand. It wasn't until I found out later that he weren't, and that's where the kid was. Had no reason to be suspicious until body was found, Sheriff. I'm telling you, this man's as guilty as sin." Peter sat back, daring not to interrupt once more as the three men continued to argue. Eventually, after some heavy persuasion and the threat of arrest, Nolan agreed to accompany the elderly sheriff back to the station, provided Clark did not come with. This left a visibly angry Clark alone with Peter, who felt extraordinarily awkward and out of place in the situation. The two sat in a tense quiet for several minutes, leaning against the wooden walls of the old bar and watching the amber fields sway in the wind across the highway. Finally, Peter spoke up. "Clark, was it? I don't think we've been officially introduced yet. Name's Peter, I'm the new preacher." "I know who you are," Clark chuckled between gritted teeth. "Ain't no one been here dressed like you since Reverend Johnson died back in May." "Ah, well, I'm sorry to have come in the middle of such a troubling time. The death of a child, especially in the way it went, ain't ever easy." Clark's expression softened a bit. "'S all right, Peter. It ain't nothing new around here. If I'm honest, shit happens all the time. Livestock dies, folks die, kids die too. Just the way it goes, I guess." Peter raised an eyebrow, turning to face the other man. "This happens often." Clark stiffened, looking uncomfortable. "Well, it's not always that bad, but yeah. Folks out here are pretty used to losing people and not always getting the answers they're wanting. Your buddy, though, Nolan, he's hiding something. Maybe not that he's a killer, but something. If that something could get the McBride family some of the answers they're hurting for, good." Peter sat back, thinking for a moment. "I wouldn't call him my buddy, you know. I met the man just a few days ago." Clark turned, stepping away from the wall and walking into the bar. "Well, then maybe you should be a bit more careful who you vouch for." The next few days were well spent trying to restore the small chapel to some resemblance of a holy place. It was difficult to believe that the decay had crept in so rapidly in the short few months since Reverend Johnson's death. Likely, the paint had been peeling for years, the dust collecting in corners unswept for far too long. Peter made his best effort to clean every nook and cranny he could get to in the sanctuary before he would bother trying to find the lost key to the back office. It was the sanctuary, after all, where he hoped to reunite the congregation of Penuel Crossing in worship. He dusted the windowsills, straightened the hymnals in the backs of the pews, and swapped broken light bulbs for new ones. By Friday, the small room was finally in a state that Peter considered worthy of its purpose. By happenstance, a visitor came to the chapel that same evening. The woman, dressed in a pale blue dress and holding a toddler to her hip, walked through the door while Peter was collecting his personal effects to begin settling into the back office. He stood up to meet her, holding an outstretched hand to shake her own. The woman looked apprehensively at his hand for a moment, as though debating whether to shake it or not. She shook her head as though clearing some unwanted thought, before relinquishing a small smile and introducing herself. "You must be Peter. I'm sorry we haven't had the chance to be introduced yet. I'm Ellen, and this is my son Micah." Peter smiled back. "It's a pleasure to meet you, both, ma'am. I'm just getting things ready for the Sunday service. I wish I'd had the time to clean it up more before the funeral, but in the state it was in." He trailed off, noticing a visual discomfort growing in Ellen's face. "I'm sorry, I'm sure you don't want to hear about the mess or the funeral. What brings you in here today?" Her creased cheeks softened once more, and she used her free hand to fish a set of keys out of her handbag. "I take it you haven't opened the back office yet, but you'll need these to get in. It'll still be locked. I forgot Emerson had them." Peter hesitantly took the rusted keyring from her hand. "Well, thank you, miss. If you don't mind me asking, why'd Emerson have them? Her face scrunched with confusion. Because of the crime scene? Crime scene? What crime scene? Her eyes went wide. No one told you? She reached out her arm, indicating she wanted the keys. Peter handed them back and followed her as she led him into the short corridor behind the pulpit leading to the preacher's office. She set Micah down on the warped wooden floor for a moment while she fidgeted with the key, struggling to fit it into the rusted keyhole. Finally, as the lock clicked open, she picked up her son once more. I don't want to go back in there. I'm so sorry they didn't tell you yet. I'm sure Emerson can help you clean up if anything, if there's still some mess left. Goodbye, Pastor. With another uncomfortable smile, Ellen left the small chapel, leaving Peter with the keys and the burning fusion of curiosity and terror for what he'd find on the other side. After a short prayer, he pulled open the creaking door, met by torn police tape hastily strewn across the threshold. As he ducked underneath, the strong smell of iron stung his nose. He looked around at the cluttered office and was taken aback by the sight before him. By all accounts, most of the room was as one would expect for a small-town pastor. Dusted bookshelves lined the walls, completely filled with all manner of different biblical translations and theological texts. A desk stood in the center of the room, still cluttered with planners, papers, and pens. In the middle of the room, however, was evidently the crime scene that Ellen had spoken about. A crater had formed in the middle of the floorboards, a hole of warped and charred wood, as though something had ruptured from beneath the floor. Shards of wood littered the whole of the office, many of which burnt and splintered, some even lodged into the ceiling above. Caked onto the front of the desk, floor, and ceiling alike near the center of the room was a substantial splattering of dried blood. Peter stepped around the hole, his puzzled mind racing for any explanation. The only one he could muster, the one that he feared the most, lodged itself firmly in his brain as he made his way around the backside of the desk. An attack, a small-scale bombing directed at the previous pastor. He allowed himself one minor sin and swore under his breath, cursing his superiors for intentionally keeping these details from him, so as not to scare him away from the position. As he looked over Pastor Johnson's desk, he scanned the various documents. Many of them were obituaries, invitations to funerals from months prior. Clark had been right. It seemed death was a common happening in Penuel Crossing. He had been looking at the documents for several minutes before the picture on the desk caught his eye. The small framed photo, placed at the corner of the desk, seemed to be a photo of Pastor Johnson with his family. Clinging to his leg was a small toddler, and at his other side was a loving wife, both of whom Peter recognized. He swore once more, frustrated at himself for not realizing earlier that Ellen and Micah were Pastor Johnson's wife and son. That night, Peter walked out of the small sheriff's office with a few answers but many more questions. Reverend Johnson had been found dead in his office on a Sunday morning 2 months ago, when the few loyal parishioners who regularly attended his weekly services found him absent from his sermon. They'd made their way to the back office, horrified to find his shredded body strewn across the office floor. Emerson and his deputy assumed, as Peter had, a small-scale bombing, but the particulars made no sense. Firstly, there was no one in town who had any grievance with Reverend Johnson or his family. As unkempt and dwindling as his small church was, many in Penuel Crossing admired the man for his renowned kindness and honesty. Secondly, although the planks were charred and blown apart, the officers had found no trace of an explosive device or an accelerant. Theories had ranged from a freak lightning strike to a meteorite hitting him through the open window, but no evidence could be found besides the damage and the body itself. It had, for obvious reasons, been a closed casket funeral. Peter confirmed with Emerson that Ellen and Micah were indeed the surviving Johnsons and asked for their address to pay them a visit. The next evening, a Saturday rife with dust and wind, Peter crossed the highway and began walking through the winding dirt roads towards the Johnson house. From afar, he could see that the small homestead was in almost as rough of a shape as the chapel had recently been. As he approached, he was startled by the sound of Ellen's voice calling out to him from behind him, in the swaying stalks of wheat that billowed off into the horizon. "Peter, what are you doing here? Can I help you with something?" The young woman emerged from the field, wiping her dusted gloves off on her ragged overalls. "Hello, Ellen. I wanted to come by and apologize for my standoffishness yesterday. I hadn't realized at the time that Reverend Johnson was your husband. Please forgive my ignorance and lack of condolence." "Oh, please, it's no worry. I figured they hadn't told you he'd been married, and I should have been more clear who I was anyhow. I appreciate you coming by, though. I do. It's been lonely here, just Micah and I lately. Please, can I invite you in for dinner? Soup should be ready by now, and we've got plenty." Peter followed her up the steps, dusting his feet off on the doormat before following her inside. "Of course, I'd be delighted." Peter waited in the entryway while Ellen retrieved her son from the living room where he was playing. She beckoned him to the kitchen to sit down, and the two talked over their food for a long while. Peter asked her how long they'd lived in Penuel Crossing, and if they intended to stay now that her husband had gone. Ellen explained to him that she'd lived there all of her life, as her parents had before her. Her late husband, on the other hand, had likewise been assigned to the church about 6 years ago, fresh out of seminary just like Peter was. The pastor whom he'd replaced hadn't died, but had simply retired. After he'd been preaching at the church for a few months, he'd become close to Ellen, and the two of them were married a year later, with Micah being born a few years after that. She explained that she'd never lived alone before. She had lived with her parents until she was 22, with a friend until she'd gotten married at 24, and with her husband until the last couple of months. "I know I've got Micah, but you can't talk with a toddler the same as an adult. It's lonely." "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. I truly am. If it helps, I'd love to come by and join you for dinner a few times a week, especially if your cooking is always this good." Ellen blushed. "We'd be happy to have you, Peter. Thank you." There were another several minutes of quiet before he asked her another question. "I don't suppose you've seen Nolan anywhere in town in the last few days? I wanted to speak to him some more about his, interesting biblical ideas." She looked quizzically at him. "Nolan? Big fella, rough face, bushy beard, big coat. He's a newcomer in town, got here day before I showed up. I figured with the town being so small and him being there when they found the McBride kid, he'd have made his introductions to everyone already. Last I heard saw him, he was going to speak with Emerson about the death." She sat back in her chair. "I think I know who you're talking about, yeah. Saw him that day, just didn't know his name. No, I haven't seen him. He a friend of yours?" "No, ma'am, I hardly know him. If you do see him, though, would you send him my way? I'm staying at the hotel for the time being, and during the day, I think I'll be working out of their lobby until Emerson can help me get the office at the chapel, cleaned out." By the time the awkwardness had abated, and either party felt comfortable enough to stand and end their meal, it was dark outside. She walked him to the door and thanked him once again for visiting. He walked along the long dirt trail back to the middle of town, his path ahead bathed in silky moonlight. As he walked, he heard a faint rustling in the fields a ways away. He turned to look and saw a figure standing in the middle of the wheat. He froze. The figure wasn't too far from where the child's body had been found. Was it Nolan? Peter crouched low, ducking behind the wall of grain, just high enough to still look over at the man, still unmoving in the fields ahead. After several minutes, Peter was able to see another figure moving through the fields, coming from the direction of the highway. Their movement was clumsy and stumbling, as though they weren't accustomed to walking through the tall stalks. As the pair met, they began speaking, and Peter could faintly hear their voices. The approaching figure was a woman, her voice dull and rather irritated. He couldn't make out the man's voice. After a short and indiscernible exchange, the male figure appeared to hand the woman what looked like a stack of bills, and the two made their way towards the highway. Peter silently followed, keeping to the dirt path and moving as slowly as he could as not to make any noise. As the pair stepped into the faint streetlight, Peter got a better look at them. The man, although not Nolan as Peter had thought, was another man he recognized, his red and sweating neck stuffed into a tight collared shirt. Clark. The woman, at most half his age, was wrapped up in a short red dress, far too tight. She wore tall heels and wore her hair in an obnoxiously poofy style. Peter breathed a sigh of relief. Although he was entirely disapproving of what Clark was doing, it seemed as though he had been in the fields to elicit an affair, not to commit murder. A mortal sin nonetheless, but one that could be corrected. Peter watched with dismay as the pair hastily crossed the interstate, entering the small hotel. When Peter had returned to his hotel room that night, he was further frustrated to discover that evidently Clark and his solicited fling had checked into the room immediately next to his own. Even as soon as he stepped through his door, he heard the sounds of their sinful exertion through the already painfully thin walls. After several minutes, the noise stopped, and Peter was hopeful that he'd be able to rest in peace. Unfortunately for him, not too long later, the activity behind his headboard resumed. It continued like this for nearly half an hour before he made the decision to make a noise complaint to the front desk. He put his shoes back on, throwing an angry glance towards Clark's room and making note of the room number for the front desk. Room 8. The attendant in the small lobby was a young man with sunken eyes, reading a pornographic magazine under the half-lit lights. He turned his gaze up to Peter, who was already leaning against the counter, tapping his finger impatiently. "Can I help you, sir?" "Hi, yes, if I can, I'd like to make a noise." He was interrupted by the young man scoffing at him. "Noise complaint, right? Room 8 gets one every Saturday. Clark and that girl are in there like clockwork. He'll check in for the night, but they're just gonna be in there for an hour. I wish I could help you out, but you're not the first person to complain about them, and you definitely won't be the last." Just then, a tremendous noise came from down the hallway, an echoing crash accompanied by what sounded, for just a moment, like the roar of machinery. The walls and floor of the shoddily constructed hotel shook, dust pouring through the cracks in the ceiling. Then, as immediately as the noise had begun, it was over in less than a second. It was shortly followed by a guttural scream, one so piercing and panicked that Peter felt his stomach drop. He looked over to the clerk, who was already standing up with keys in hand. What few other guests there were peered out from their doors as Peter and the clerk ran towards room number 8. The screaming from the room had not stopped, but had softened, turning into a choking, wailing sob. The clerk struggled with the keys for a moment before realizing that something was pressing against the door from the other side. With Peter's help, they managed to push open the stuck door. The room inside was utterly demolished. Furniture of all sorts laid in myriad pieces, splinters of wood and cushioning torn and strewn about. The wall that had once been far end with the window was now little more than a gaping hole, planks and broken glass strewn outwards into the parking lot ahead. In the far corner of the room, the young woman sat screaming, wrapping herself in a once white sheet now entirely soaked in fresh blood. One leg sat exposed, or at least what was once a leg. Now, everything below the knee was a shredded mess of mangled skin, muscle, and bone. Her foot, entirely flattened and still bleeding, clung on only by a few stringy tendons. Peter rushed over to help her, but tripped over something in the frayed mess on the floor, narrowly catching himself from falling headfirst into a pile of sharply broken wood. He turned to see what he'd tripped over, uncovering it from the similarly bloodied sheets strewn over and around what was once a bed. When the sheet was haphazardly removed and he could finally see who lay beneath, he could hardly stop himself from vomiting. Clark's body was entirely destroyed. Beneath the shredded linen, skewered with furniture shards and box springs, his corpse so fresh that spurts of blood still pumped from the hundreds of torn wounds. Every limb was tucked at impossible angles around the upper torso, which itself was twisted and folded nearly in half. His midsection was flattened entirely, his entrails haphazardly squeezing out from either side of him and tangled in the mess. The skin on his stomach was blackened and tight. Peter stepped away from the body once more to aid the young woman. He couldn't bear to look at Clark's shattered form any longer. He looked like roadkill. By the time Sheriff Emerson arrived, Peter and the young clerk had wrapped the woman's leg in a bedsheet to stop the bleeding, and had cleared much of the drywall and rubble out of the way to make a path for a stretcher. "We don't have paramedics here," the sheriff explained. "I went ahead and called the nearest city, but they're a 45-minute drive out, maybe 40 if they hurry. What the hell happened here?" Peter surveyed the scene, finally letting his shock subside and his curiosity take over. "Looks like a truck, or something big at least, ran down the wall and ran over them both. By the state of Clark, looks like he might have been dragged through the rubble by the tires." Emerson squinted, rubbing the stubble on his chin with his knobby hands. "I thought so too at first. But look at the wall." Peter's attention once more rose to the wall, trying to make sense of whatever detail the sheriff had gleaned from its demolished beams and scattered drywall chunks. He was about to say that he didn't understand the sheriff's meaning when the realization struck him. All of the debris from the wall itself was cast outside of the hotel, not inwards. He looked back up at the Emerson, who was already giving him a look that said, "You see what I mean?" "But that doesn't make any sense. I can see the tire marks. There had to have been a truck." "I know, but whatever tore up the room didn't come from outside. It came from in here, breaking down the wall as it went." The pair followed the trail of rubble with their eyes. There was a clear start point inside the room, several feet from the door. They continued on, carving valleys in the piles of splintered wood and in Clark's body until they finally made their way outside. There, as suddenly as they'd begun inside, the marks of burnt rubber disappeared. The pair stepped through the shattered wall into the cool night air. "Peter, have you seen Nolan Carver since I questioned him Monday?" "No, sir, I have not. By now, I'd assumed he'd already skipped town." "I thought so too, but I saw him on the way here. He didn't respond when I called out to him." "Where was he?" "Between here and the Ellen Johnson's house. He seemed odd. Looked like he had a lot on his mind, just staring out into the fields. With how suspicious he's been, he's a suspect now. I hope you understand, him being your friend and all." Peter let out a sigh. "I assure you, the man is not my friend. We've met only twice now, that's it. I barely know him." Somewhere off in the distance, a bird cawed out in the fields, and the pair turned their heads to look. Against the shrouded sky, barely visible in the dimmed street lights, several crows flew out of the fields, disturbed by something large hunched out near the edge by the highway. "Hey you in the fields, who's there?" Emerson shined his flashlight out towards the source of the rustling. In the dim light, two glistening eyes stared back at Peter and the sheriff, before standing up tall and swiftly turning to run into the fields. "Nolan!" "There he goes!" Emerson shouted, and the two of them took off in pursuit. Within seconds, Nolan's large frame vanished into the swaying darkness of the fields, swallowed by the shifting walls of wheat. Only the heady rhythm of his footsteps gave any indication where he was going, fading and reappearing as the stalks bent and swayed. Emerson barreled ahead with his flashlight high, the pale beam searching erratically across the grain. Peter followed close behind, the brittle stalks snapping against his coat as he pushed through. Every so often he caught a glimpse of a movement ahead, always just a glance of a bobbing head or a hunched frame, fleeting before it sank back into golden shadows of the fields. Nolan was always just far enough ahead to stay out of sight. Peter's lungs burned. Each breath labored against the cold, dry air. He He slowed, letting Emerson pull several yards ahead, the sheriff's flashlight bobbing the blackness, getting further and further away. The beam jumped from side to side, searching for something to anchor to. As Peter's breath returned, he took a deep breath through his nose. He almost choked. Sharp, acrid scent cutting through the smell of dust and dry stalks. Peter froze mid-breath, nostrils flaring. That same harsh chemical tang he had smelled the night they found the child, rising from dry soil that should smell like barley and dust. The air felt suddenly heavier, thicker, as if he were breathing through wet cloth. He opened his mouth to call to Emerson, but stopped. Ahead of him, the sheriff's stride broke. Emerson pitched forward, vanishing into the wheat as if the earth itself had swallowed him. One moment he was there, the next, gone. His flashlight tumbled into the grain, the beam swinging wildly once before also cutting out, leaving only darkness and the faint rustle of disturbed stalks. "Emerson, you all right?" There was no response. Peter steadily walked ahead, expecting to stumble over Emerson's fainted body in the wheat, but there was nothing. After a few moments alone in the dark, Peter's eyes adjusted to see something just ahead in the dimming moonlight. The green tractor, half sunk into the ground. Beside it, silent and still, stood Nolan. His hands were in his pockets as he stared at the soil with an unsettling focus. Peter approached nervously. It was you, wasn't it? You really did murder that poor child and bury him out here." Nolan stood still, his large silhouette stark against the pale grain. Peter could now see what his eyes were locked onto. The disturbed hole in the ground, the hole that he'd instructed the other men to dig in order to pull the body out of the soil. Peter spoke once more. "Clark was right, wasn't he? You killed the boy and tried to bury him out here. Then tonight you killed Clark so he wouldn't talk. I don't know how you did it, but you did." Nolan sighed. "I'm not responsible for those deaths. I know how it looks, Peter, but there's an inevitability to this place. A certainty in death, even if it wasn't certain just yet. Does it matter, Peter, if it's going to happen then? Does it matter if it happens now, or all at once?" Peter stepped forward. "Do you hear yourself? Do you hear how insane you sound? Sheriff Emerson, where'd you go?" Emerson, if he was still present, remained silent. Nolan sighed. "Help should be coming soon enough, but Emerson is gone. It's just you and me. Soon it'll just be you. I'm not here to hurt anyone, I promise you. But I needed to watch it happen." Peter took a step forward. "Watch it happen? What, so you didn't kill them, but you did know they were going to die and didn't do anything? Why?" "Because I can't. I just can't. If I step in, I have to leave. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is." Peter could not contain his anger any longer. With a shout, he charged Nolan, slamming into him hard enough to drive them both into the stalks. The wheat thrashed and snapped beneath them as they slammed the ground. Nolan's hands came up fast, one locking around Peter's shoulder, the other bracing against his chest, trying to shove him away. Peter swung back, clawing for leverage, his breath hot and ragged as he screamed, "How did you do it? How did you kill Clark?" They rolled in the dirt, each trying to get the upper hand. Nolan moved with a measured strength, every shift of his weight deliberate, but Peter was all fury and momentum, fueled by pure conviction. The grain bent and broke under their bodies, the ground uneven beneath their boots. Once, Nolan tried to twist away, but Peter latched onto his coat, dragging him back down with a grunt. Nolan groaned. "Peter, stop this. I'm not the enemy." Peter's knee drove into Nolan's ribs. Nolan grunted, wrenching himself free just long enough to shove Peter off balance. The nimble preacher came right back at him, knocking the wind from Nolan's lungs. In the dim moonlight, their shadows tangled like one shape, thrashing in the field. Finally, with a surge of strength, Nolan hooked his boot against Peter's hip and kicked, sending him stumbling backward into the wheat. Peter landed hard, the air bursting from his chest. "Stop this, you need to trust me, Peter." Peter groaned, clutching his bruised side. I can't. I don't. As he lunged forward once more, the chemical scent overpowered him, sharp and stinging in his nostrils. His next step, intended to plant firmly on solid ground, gave way entirely, his leg plunging downward. The earth seemed to dissolve beneath him, the dry stalks vanishing into nothing. In an instant, he was swallowed whole, falling into frigid water. The shock stole the breath from his lungs in a searing gasp as icy currents closed over his head, gripping his body firmly. It was as if the water had risen from nowhere, summoned from the dry soil to swallow him whole. The darkness of the sky above was replaced by a blinding light, a shining white that peered from above the surface, burning through the wavering ceiling of the water. Peter kicked upward toward it, arms straining, but his heavy coat and shoes prevented him from ascending as he sunk deeper. His movements slowed, each one more difficult than the last, until he could feel the water seeping into him, filling his lungs, pressing against his ribs. He sunk further beneath the surface, his consciousness slipping with every second as panic pounded through his heart. Dancing above him, mixed in the swirling caustics, Peter saw a shifting, radiant form. Vast, luminous shapes folding and unfolding like wings made of light itself. It bent and shimmered with the slow ebbing of the water, casting shadows that rippled like a kaleidoscope. Countless glimmers traced perfect, impossible arcs around it, moving with a circular precision his mind could not follow. The sight gnawing at the edges of thought as the last of his awareness slipped away. Without warning, a hand plunged into the water, a rough, scarred hand. Nolan's hand. It reached out, grabbing Peter by the collar and pulling him out of the icy water and back into the dry darkness of the ground. Peter sat, rubbing the stinging wetness out of his eyes and coughing up water, before trying and failing to regain his composure. There was no water, save for that soaking his clothes, and Nolan was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Emerson. As Peter coughed up the last of the water, the edges of his vision became fuzzy, growing darker while his head throbbed with pain. As he lost consciousness, he swore he heard a familiar voice calling out to him, the voice of Ellen Johnson. When Peter awoke the next day in the hospital, Ellen was by his side. She looked tired, her hair pulled back hastily, and there was dirt on the cuffs of her sleeves. She told him that Nolan had visited her that evening, not long after Peter had left. He had told her plainly that something bad was going to happen out in the fields that night and that she needed to be there to help. There was no further explanation given, and he left. When she'd found Peter unconscious among the wheat, she'd run for help, flagging down the ambulance that had just arrived to pick up the mangled prostitute. She had insisted, to the point of argument, that they could surely make room for a nearly drowned man. They never found Emerson. Peter thanked her for her kindness and for saving his life. He also told her, with great regret, that he would not be able to attend the dinners she'd so warmly invited him to. After everything, he would be leaving Penuel Crossing, and he had no intention of ever returning. It was 30 years later when he did return, though, for Ellen's funeral. On the day before the burial, Peter found himself driving into a city that had devoured the town he once knew. A new interstate cut through the land where the wheat used to sway, and the air smelled faintly of asphalt and exhaust instead of dust and sun-warmed grain. As the intersection site between the two interstates, Penuel Crossing had naturally grown tenfold. The endless amber fields had been scraped away, replaced by glassy office buildings, chain restaurants, and neat grids of cheap apartments. He had to search his memory to place where her old house had stood, now somewhere beneath a parking lot. He checked into a large hotel, not far from where that sunken tractor might have been 30 years prior. The young clerk behind the counter was aloof, reminding him uncomfortably of the one from that night so long ago. The boy barely looked up from his newspaper as he handed over the keycard. Peter asked if he could borrow the paper for just a moment as the headline caught his eye. The article wrote that several unsecured propane tanks that had tumbled from a truck on a construction site the week prior and ruptured in the empty lot, where an old local church had recently been demolished. No one was reported injured, though the article mentioned traces of blood and splintered wood found at the scene. Peter returned the paper. He pocketed his room key and began his walk to the elevator. Halfway down the corridor, a sharp, familiar scent curled into his nostrils. It stopped him in his tracks. He knew the scent by name now, though all those years ago it had been only a strange, stinging note in the air. Chlorine. Drawn by it, he followed the smell until he found its source. A glass door leading to the small indoor pool. A worker in overalls was finishing up his work, skimming the pale blue water with a long-handled net. The room was bright and sterile, echoing faintly under the hum of the overhead lights. Peter lingered by the doorway, even after the worker had left. He watched, eyes fixed on the empty pool and the blinding, glittering lights it reflected. He looked on, transfixed, as something stirred beneath the water, for just a moment before the water went still once more. Several stalks of wheat bubbled to the surface.